Okay, g'day guys, this is Mr. James Dundon from Anytime Education. We've got a cracking video today. If you want to see more of our videos, check out our website. We've just gone live on Facebook as well. Check that out, Anytime Education. You can also follow me on Twitter, James_Dundon. Post questions, discuss, get the conversations going. How about this specimen here? What a beast. We're going to be looking at speciation today, so let's get stuck in. Okay, sorry about that introduction. I know it was a bit lame, but YOLO. Okay, so just before we get started, I just wanted to make sure I tell you, definitely this video, make sure you make it to the end because I've attached something at the end. That's one of my favorites, so stick right to the end. Okay, speciation is what we're talking about today. So firstly, what is a species? Well, we see them all the time. We've got dogs and cats and horses and tigers. I went to the zoo the other day and I saw so many species. There are millions of species. But what is a species? Well, I've got a horse here. Yes, you would say yes. Yes, Mr. Dundon, that's a species. Excellent. And I've got a donkey. And you go, yes, that's a donkey, that's a species for sure. But then I'll throw this one out here. A mule. And hopefully you think to yourself, well, hang on a second. Is that a species? Well, in fact, it's not. Okay? Because the definition of a species, and the most commonly accepted definition of a species, is that it's two organisms that can reproduce together to produce fertile offspring, where the mule is not fertile. The mule cannot reproduce. And that's sad. But we must push on. So why can't it reproduce? Well, let's have a look here. Let's take the normal cell of a horse. We have 64 chromosomes. 64 chromosomes in normal cells of a horse. And then we've got a donkey. Now, a donkey has 62 chromosomes in its normal cells. Okay? So how's that related? Well, in fact, when a horse is ready to reproduce, it's got to produce sperm. So this is a male horse. We're going to produce some sperm. Now that sperm is going to be haploid, which means it's going to have half the number of chromosomes. Now, if you're unsure of that process, check out my meiosis video on Anytime Education. And if you can't find it, I'm redoing it. So check out another one, but keep coming back. So we've got 32 chromosomes, so half the number of a normal cell. And that's important because if we combined two 64 chromosomes together, that would be massive. You can see the problems that individuals have, if we have just one extra chromosome. For example, Down syndrome. That's just one extra chromosome on chromosome 21, and you have all those different conditions or different characteristics because of that. So imagine 64 extra chromosomes. That can't be good. So when we divide an egg cell, divide a cell to become an egg cell for the donkey, sorry Eddie Murphy, we're going to get 31 chromosomes. Okay? So that's fine. We can double 31, produce 62. But when this sperm and this egg come together, we get 63 chromosomes. That's no good. It's okay for mitosis because mitosis is just replicating the DNA, doubling it, and then evenly distributing it between two cells. So that's fine. But when that mule goes to make sperm or egg cells, what's half of 63? Well, that's not a full number, is it? That's a fraction. That's 31 and a half. We can't get that. So we can't actually produce sperm or egg for the mule, so we can't form a fertile offspring. So then remember, that is the definition of speciation. Two individuals that reproduce together to produce fertile offspring. Okay. The other term that we have to be able to know and understand is populations. Now, a population is just the same species, but living in a group in the same area. Okay, so more than one of the same species living in the same area. And I've just organise that for you here. Okay. So I've got a sort of a pond or a lake environment, and I've got lots of fish. These are all the same species, living in this environment, having fun, reproducing, having babies, all the good stuff. Okay? But there are one population. Okay? There might be this species somewhere else, that would be a different population. This species in this area is this population. Okay? So how does this relate to speciation? Well, in fact, let's imagine that they are having a great time, but it starts to get a little bit hot. We have a bit of a really hot summer. And what happens is the water level starts to go down. Okay? It goes down so much that we actually separate our fish into two separate populations now. You know, these 3 fish might represent, you know, a few hundred, and these 3 a few hundred. But we've essentially separated them now. Okay, we've separated these into 2 separate populations. Now, the event that did that is called geographical isolation. Now, in the example I've shown, it's a water level dropping and separating the 2 species. But it could be a ridge, a mountain forming, some kind of geological event that has now separated our population. Okay? Now, we all know, especially if you watch my last video, Natural Selection, check it out, we know that populations have variation. So we're going to have these fish with maybe slightly oranger colour, maybe slightly different fin lengths, slightly different behavioural patterns. So there's variation in the population. When they were allowed to mix, we had a total gene pool. Now that total gene pool was the total genes of every individual in that population combined. Okay, and that's really important for reproducing and having variation for natural selection purposes. So when these populations are alone and separated, we're going to have natural selection still occurring, aren't we? So we're going to have selective pressures acting on these 2 populations of fish. If it's an abiotic factor, it's going to be a non-living factor, and that could be the amount of light entering each pond. It might be the amount of dissolved oxygen. It could be currents, anything that may select different characteristics of this population and change their frequency. By changing the frequency, I mean we're more likely to see a specific characteristic in an individual. So that frequency goes up. However, we're going to have different selective pressures over here, different advantageous characteristics, so they are going to increase in frequency. Over time, what we're going to get is we're going to get a change in population. So I'm just going to remove these fish here. So they're changing and changing and changing, and eventually we start to, oh, I just killed that one. There we go. They're going to be changing and changing, and now they look quite different. So let me just set it up back again. Okay, so the populations are now so different, they actually look different as well. And that will happen because of those different selective pressures and those different advantageous characteristics. Okay, now, how is that related to speciation? Well, we haven't quite got a different species yet. The only way that we know if we've got a different species is if suddenly we have a bit more water, the water level comes down, and they can interact again now. Oops. So they can interact. Now, if they can reproduce again and produce fertile offspring, we know they're still the same species. However, if they can't reproduce, it means they are now separate species. What could stop them from reproducing? Well, I'm just going to move this to the side. I'm going to tell you. Let's imagine that this fish here, green fish, are giving all the best pickup lines to the orange fish, and they're not working. Imagine if orange is doing its funny little tail wag saying, come at me. But the green fish don't understand. That means, you know, a green light. They're behavioural isolations. Okay? So they're behavioural isolations. What about if they just lived in different habitats? Well, that'd be a habitat isolation. But we don't have that in this case. So everything that stops them from reproducing, we now say that they have become reproductively isolated. And the reproductive isolation can be categorized into two main areas. Pre-zygotic. So pre means before, zygote means a fertilized cell. So how do we stop things from ever getting fertilized? Well, I've talked about habitat isolation. We've talked about all the failing pickup lines. Well, what about temporal isolation? Temporal isolation, it means that they ovulate or they produce eggs at different times of the year. So maybe the orange fish are producing eggs in January, February, March, but the green fish are producing eggs in September to December. So they never actually match up. Mechanical isolation, the fun one. So, you know, think about your different species. Could they actually do it? Do they have compatible parts that actually fit together? And if they don't, then they're never going to be able to get a sperm to an egg, are they? So that's mechanical isolation. Now let's say all of those things are okay. They're in the same habitat. Behavior is working. Temporal isolation is at the same time. Mechanical isolation, they fit together. Well, even in all those circumstances, most of the time it still doesn't work. And that's because of post-zygotic reproductive isolation. So post meaning after we've formed a zygote. So most of the time when we produce a zygote, we have decreased hybrid viability. And what that means is that, yes, we fertilized it, but the chromosomes are so different that the embryo or the zygote doesn't even develop. It just dies. And that's most common. If, however, it does go on to reproduce, what we notice is those hybrids lack fertility. So they lack fertility. And we saw that with the horse and the donkey. So they couldn't actually reproduce. Okay? So just to summarize, speciation is caused by a geographical event, geographical isolation, which then may lead to reproductive isolation through habitat isolation, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, or mechanical isolation, or post-zygotically through decreased hybrid viability or hybrid fertility that doesn't work. Okay, so infertile hybrids. Okay, now I hope that was helpful. Try and use these terms when you're answering questions in like a test. If you have any more questions, please post them below. Check out Anytime Education. Check me out on Twitter, and have fun. Catch you later, guys.
Coming down the slide hard, simmer and go. Simmer braces for it. Shot. Save! Oh!